Luke 12:32-40. Fear not, little flock, for it has pleased your Abba to give you the kingdom. Sell what you own and give the money to poorer people. Make purses for yourself that don't wear out, treasures that won't fail you, in heaven that thieves can't steal and moths can't destroy. For wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. Be dressed and ready, and keep your lamps lit. Be like the household staff awaiting the owner's return from a wedding, so that when the owner arrives and knocks, you'll open the door without delay. It will go well with those staff members whom the owner finds wide awake upon returning. I tell you the absolute truth, the owner will put on an apron, seat them at table, and proceed to wait on them. Should the owner happen to come at midnight or before sunrise and find them prepared, it will go well with them. Understand this, no homeowner who knew when a thief was coming would have let the thief break in. So be on guard. The promised one will come when least expected. La palabra de Dios. Gracias a Dios.
When I used to teach, I'd wander around. Somebody asked me a question, I'd go off on this direction. So I got in the habit of making an outline of what I was going to say, so I would keep some direction. I want to tell you the most important thing I learned in 50 years of studying the New Testament. One of the most important things, maybe the most important thing. And I'll tell you why. I was raised in a fundamentalist congregation in North Texas. The way we read the Bible, the most important book in the Bible was 1 Timothy. And 1 Timothy is toward the end of the New Testament. Toward the end of 1 Timothy chapter 2, it tells women to be quiet in church. And my mother, all her 92 years, said nothing in church. Not a word. She believed that crap. Her brother, LD, kind of accidentally went to college, wound up getting a PhD in chemistry from the University of California, Berkeley, and becoming chairperson of the science division at Pepperdine. Mother had his mind. She was never permitted to speak in church, and she swallowed that. I'm a male, I'm slow emotionally. But a few years, 20 years into this study, I figured out why I was kept studying these passages about women being quiet in church. And I still get angry when I talk about that subject. Another part of my education is that 20 years later, I could explain why, but I got into going to Pompeii in Italy. I was trying to convince my colleagues that it wasn't really about the pasta and the Italian wine that I love so much. I was just going to do research, right? But I went very often. And the picture on part of your outline is from Pompeii. I took this picture. The room is 2,000 years old. The couches and the tables were reconstructed by Italian archaeologists. So the couches and the tables are modern. Okay, great. Thanks, Brent. Now, okay. In the passage I read, verse 37 reads like this: Blessed are those slaves whom when the Messiah finds alert when he comes, truly I tell you, the Messiah will fasten his belt and have them all sit down. Now it's translated sit down because that's all we'd understand. We sit down when we eat, right? But the Greek actually says lie down, recline. See, and you can see in this picture, they lay down when they ate. All around the Mediterranean, from Italy to Greece to Judea to Egypt, the elite ate in triclinia with 3 couches like this picture. You know, if you're laying down on your butt, you got to have somebody to serve you, right? Slaves come in and serve these people. It's an acting out of their superiority. You lie down and recline and somebody else puts the food on the table, you're demonstrating your power. See, so this verse 37 is quite socially revolutionary. In Jesus' parable, blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. I tell you, the Messiah will fasten his belt and have the slaves lie down, and he'll serve them. It turns the societal practice of patriarchy and hierarchy upside down around the whole Mediterranean. In several ways, Jesus was a social revolutionary. He didn't buy that stuff about slaves had to serve these elite people lying on their rear ends all around the Mediterranean. Now, I'm going to point number 2. There are passages in the New Testament that don't agree with that. In Christianity in the 20th century in North America, we don't all agree, right? I never convinced my mother, but what I'm going to tell you. She lived in that fundamentalist, first Democratic, then Republican right-wing society, and they didn't have counselors. We called this guy a male preacher. We didn't call him a pastor. He wasn't. The only thing known in that society was this kind of patriarchal society. So these texts were written in Rome. Trump said he could shoot somebody on the street and it'd be okay. Roman emperors did. They didn't just theorize about it. They constructed amphitheaters, and they watched people die for the fun of it, for lions and gladiators. And, death was an entertainment for these Caesars. It wasn't just an idea. It was acted out in Corinth, where Paul was. And Christians lived into that society over several decades. So Jesus began with the parable we just read, and then the church survived in this empire, right? I have a student from Senegal who learned what it was to survive in the French domination. I have a student from Zimbabwe, and the British in Zimbabwe killed his father, among others. It was not easy. African Americans in the United States were lynched. Violence goes along with empire, and it intimidates people. And I was just telling you, I've been studying amphitheater art. It's very ugly. I hate to even talk about it sometimes, but it terrorized people. And so the church gradually accommodated in order to survive in the Roman Empire. And toward the latter part, so there was Jesus and then Paul, and then Paul's students. In the ancient world, there was a great teacher like Plato, a great teacher like Aristotle or Epicurus or Isaiah. They were not as individualistic as we are. See, I'm wandering around. I'm disappearing from this Zoom. Plato's students wrote tractates with the name of Plato on it. See, in our individualistic society, if I teach a class and some students plagiarizes something, they get an F. But they were not individualistic like we are. They were part of a community. They were part of the Platonic school. So there are a number of tractates with Plato's name on them that are by Plato's students. Same thing is true of Aristotle. Some of the tractates that have his name on them are not by Aristotle, and the same is true of Epicurus. And in the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah of Jerusalem wrote around 721 BCE. The second Isaiah wrote around 587, 150 years later. It's all in the same book, right? Very different. But you belong to this school, and this is what, Isaiah said 150 years ago. And the same thing is true of Paul. Paul was a wild rebel. He was uncontained, right? He offended a lot of people. And his students living in the Roman Empire tamed him down a little bit, right? More than a little bit. I'm going to read one of these passages that tames Paul down. Women played an active part in the Pauline congregations. He calls a woman named, in Romans 16, he calls a woman named Junia, an apostle. That didn't work in the later church. They had to be males, right? So that was forgotten or suppressed. So, but as Christians lived into the Roman Empire, they learned, and they lived and worshiped in Roman houses, like the ones in Pompeii. Like I was showing you this picture earlier. And they learned how to live in those houses, right? So so first I'll read this passage from Colossians. And I'm going to read the passage from Colossians. I have the outline of it on the handout I gave you. But this is Colossians 3:18 and following. I'll read the actual text. I keep wandering around from. So I always say, I'm just reading this. I didn't write it, right? Don't throw stones. Wives, be subject to your husbands. That's what my mother read. And the males in the congregation who were teaching her how to behave. Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and never treat them harshly. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is your acceptable duty to the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children. It doesn't say parents, it says fathers. Do not provoke your children, or they may lose heart. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and only while being watched, not only while being watched in order to please them, but wholeheartedly serving the Lord. Whatever your task, put yourselves into it as done for the Lord and not for your masters, since you know that from the Lord you will receive your inheritance as your reward, your service to the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for whatever wrong has been done, and there's no partiality. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you also have a master in heaven. Now, on the handout I passed out, there's a very nice little pattern. It's not kind of general thoughts about women and general thoughts about slaves. There's a very clear pattern here. It has two parts. There are three pairs: wives, husbands, children, parents, slaves, masters. And in every pair, the point is subordination. So the Old Testament has passages about women, and passages about slaves, and passages about children, but nowhere in the Old Testament does this pattern appear. This is not a Jewish pattern. I wrote a dissertation at Yale University on this text, and it occurs only one place in all of Greco-Roman literature. We know where this came from. It did not fall from heaven. I'm now to point 3. And again, I repeat, I'm just reading this, don't throw rocks. This is from the only place in the ancient world where you find this nice pattern is in Aristotle, a rich white man from Greece. And here's his reasoning. Here are the assumptions behind that passage. The primary, and he writes a book called Politics. The first part of that book is about the household, and you learn how to behave in the house, and the rest of the books are about the city. So when you've learned how to behave at home, you know how to behave in the city, right? He does both. But again, the title is Politics. It's not about individual ethics. It's about how to behave in society. So the first part of this, I'm reading from Aristotle's Politics, Book 1. The primary smallest parts of the household are, and you've heard these before, right? Master and slave, husband and wife, father and children. There are the three pairs. And I'm telling you, the only place in Jewish or Greco-Roman literature that it occurs. Nowhere else. Now here's his argument. Authority and subordination are conditions not only inevitable, he argues, but also expedient. It's a good thing. In every composite part, where there's a plurality of parts, there is combined to make a single common whole. There's always found a ruling and a subject factor. Always, he argues. The animal, for example, consists of soul and body, of which the soul is by nature the ruling, the body the subject factor. Now here's the stinking sentence. Between the sexes, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior. The male ruler and the female subject. That's the assumption behind these three pairs. And it gets worse, or I don't know, continues stinking. The same must also necessarily apply in the case of humankind generally. No, he would say mankind. Therefore, all men that differ as widely as the soul does from the body, these are by nature slaves, for whom to be governed by this kind of authority is to their good. Now, that's a long way from Luke 12, right? When a group exists in a culture, in a foreign culture, they accommodate, acculturate, assimilate. I'll think of an example when a Mexican family moves to Texas and the little boy or the little girl gets their own room, right? Sometimes they'd rather be back in Mexico playing with all their friends. You know? They're kind of isolated when they get to Texas, and they've got all these, you know, they're all by themselves in this room. It's inevitable that a group who migrates accommodates to that society. And early Christians did that. So in the latter part of the New Testament, we get this crap about household and Roman way of ruling that is a long way from Jesus. So I draw certain conclusions under point 4. Christ's parable is virtually the opposite of the Colossians household code, of the Aristotelian Roman ethic about how to live in Roman patriarchal, tyrannical society. The heart of the gospel concerns Christ's cross and resurrection, at least according to Paul. You know, and I could read you in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, I've got to move back over here, so. I handed on to you as of first importance what I also in turn had received, that Christ died, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day. So Christ's suffering and resurrection is the heart of the gospel. And it's not just about Christ, it's also about us. We have crosses in our own lives, all of us. Pains. Part of our life that we lived that is suddenly over. We all experience death in one way or another. No, that life is gone. I have to build a new one. God is with us in that process. As God was with Christ through the cross and the resurrection, God promises to be with us in our individual and social pains. And it's about learning to live again anew in a more just, more fair society. But point 3, the ethical consequences of our confession of Christ today differ from those drawn by Paul's disciples in Colossians. They lived in a society where, I mean, my students from the third world say it's a matter of, you know, for the French or the English, it's a matter of security and domination. For those who are dominated, it's a matter of surviving in this society. And they survived by accommodating to Roman society, including Christians. But we live in we claim, egalitarian, gender fair, non-slave society. The consequences of our confession of Christ, cross and resurrection, differ from the ones that were drawn in the Roman Empire, whether it's in the New Testament or not. So when we enter the front door, we do not leave our minds or our voices, whether we're male-bodied or female-bodied, outside. We debate as they did in the New Testament. They debate what it meant to worship Christ. You know, I mean, just to make that, I can't help but read passage, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians. And where's Galatians? Point about, out of Galatians chapter 2, I'll move back over here. Paul says, Paul the apostle, when Cephas Peter, the apostle Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James in Jerusalem, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but then they came, he drew back and kept himself separate. So they were not pure enough. So I could go on reading, but the point is, Peter and Paul debated about what it meant to serve Christ. And we debate in the 21st century. And there's debate within the New Testament. That's not, that there's a lot of variety in the New Testament is Christ lived around 30, and then the gospel just spread like wildfire around the Mediterranean, from Judea to Syria to Turkey to Greece to Rome. You think all those people agreed? James in Jerusalem, Matthew in Syria, Paul the rebel out in Ephesus, maybe Luke in Rome. There are a few differences between those people, just as there are in the 21st century. So we are a community. Salt and light, I understand us, you, as the light of the world. We are a symbol of the non-patriarchal form of Christianity. It's the way I understand it. We've had a female pastor, a lot of women with children. We are not like some of the congregations I grew up in Texas, where my mother was silent. So the question I'm raising is about the relationship between Jesus and the New Testament. I don't worship the New Testament. I've spent 50 years studying it. I'm fascinated, but my Lord is Christ, not the New Testament. And I have to think about it and understand their debates when I try to draw consequences for my own life. So I think we're at that part of the service where we can divide up into one-to-ones, if you choose to do that. At some point, I'd be glad to answer some questions or respond to some thoughts you have about the presentation. I'm not trying to tell you the only way to read the New Testament. I'm telling you the way I read it after some study. And we probably will differ in this congregation. And that's okay. This is what I'm arguing they already did in the New Testament. But it has huge consequences. The only passages we read in Amarillo, Texas, were about women being quiet. Those about the slaves. Anyhow, we're very choosy about our patriarchal reading of the New Testament. We don't have to do that. This stuff from Aristotle is crap, and it shouldn't have gotten into our New Testament. No. So, I think let's see. Yeah. So one of the values we hold as a community is that we honor the wisdom of the gathered community, alongside the wisdom of Scripture and our preacher or storyteller. As a part of Leaven community, we'd like to invite you into two practices of sacred organizing that help make meaning and deepen relationships. One is the practice of reflection, and the other is the practice of one-to-one conversation. We want to emphasize that there's never an obligation, only an invitation to participate. Number one, if you're interested in meeting with one other person to reflect on the Scripture and the sermon that was shared today, stay in the sanctuary and we'll have about, what should we say, 10 minutes for a conversation. Or you're also welcome to pray, reflect, or help yourself to a cup of coffee in the sunroom, and we'll call you back when we're ready to return. If you're on Zoom, you're also welcome to stay in the main room and share with each other. Let the host know if you'd like to have a one-to-one conversation with someone, and they can make that happen. So the question is, which you can ask a different one, what's the relationship between our confession of Christ and what we're reading in the New Testament?